good Vach, Shavua Tov, a good week to you, my holy sisters and brothers. Wonderful to be learning with you. Whoa. Sorry about that. Wonderful to be learning with you on a Saturday night. Talk about starting your week off right. Let's light up the darkness with a new wisdom candle. Who is with us on a Saturday night? Sharon in New Jersey, Paul in Chicago, Yosef in Massachusetts, Bill in mid-Missouri, Paul in the great Northwest. And it skipped on me. There it goes. Wait a minute. There we go. Sharon, I would love to hear this sung by the melody's writer, my friend Debbie Friedman. That was the Maccabeats singing with Natanel Hershtik. And Dale, and the whole world misses Debbie. Dale says, Shabbat Shalom, my Jewish brothers and sisters. What are we talking about? And Ira says it's Sunday morning here. Maybe you're over there in Europe or Israel. Welcome, everybody. Also, Rochelle saying Shavua Tov on the YouTube side. All right, we are approaching the end of Tractate Yevamos. Still about 12 days to go. We are in chapter 13 on page 110. Tonight we're concluding our discussion of MIshna number 5 here in chapter 13, and then we'll start MIshna number 6. This chapter, so Yevamos is tractate 14 of the Talmud. These are the laws of levirate marriage. Here in chapter 13, we're looking at another sort of related marriage law that touches on levirate marriage, which is when a minor girl is married off to a man by her family, that kind of thing that was happening in the ancient world, not today. But even so, if she was married off by her family, she retained a right of refusal. She could walk away from that marriage, and in doing so, she annuls the marriage as if it never was. So what happens if a minor girl is in such a marriage and it is considered not a marriage by Torah law, but rather only by rabbinic law, because she can walk away from it at any time? It's not binding in the way that a regular marriage is. But if while she's still married and before she has refused, her husband dies, leaving a brother and this widow by Torah law, so then what is the impact on the laws of yibum is what we are discussing here in this chapter, and other ways that it can touch on yibum as well. All right, so we picked this up on 110a, sort of late in the discussion of MIshna number 5, and the Gemara asks, and did Rav actually say that when he, the husband, engaged in sexual intercourse with her, yes, the original marriage is valid, and if he did not have intercourse with her, no, it is not valid. But wasn't there an incident in the city of Neresh where a woman was betrothed when she was a minor, and she reached majority, so she became a legal adult, and the husband seated her in a bridal chair under the marriage canopy and had not yet had intercourse with her to consummate the marriage, and another man came and seized her from him and married her. Right, so normally there's two stages, Erison and Nisuin, betrothal and marriage. And usually that when we get to the marriage stage, it's done under a chuppah, under the wedding canopy. And then they're fully married. The marriage has been consummated, as it were, even if they haven't had intercourse yet. Intercourse is another way to move from betrothal to full marriage. We usually don't do it that way. We do it with standing under the canopy and getting married. So here what happened was this man was betrothed to a girl while she was still a minor. They waited. She became an adult, and then they got married. So she was under the wedding canopy, but I guess they hadn't finished the ceremony under the wedding canopy, and they certainly hadn't consummated the union. And some other man came along, and I don't know if he kidnapped her or seduced her or grabbed her or what, but basically attempted to marry this girl that was betrothed to another man. Okay, but she was only betrothed when she was a minor. So that's why they're questioning whether that betrothal was a fully valid betrothal. And then she hadn't become fully married yet because they didn't finish the ceremony under the canopy when this marauding second husband wannabe came in and grabbed her. So what happened? Another man came and seized her from him and married her. And Rav Bruna and Rav Hananel, the students of Rav, were there. And they did not require her to receive a bill of divorce from the latter husband. Meaning this attempt by the second man to marry her had no merit whatsoever. And when they got the girl back from him, they didn't even require a bill of divorce from that man, because whatever he did had no effect. The girl was married to the first husband whom she was betrothed and with whom she was sitting under the wedding canopy when she was snatched. So presumably they regarded her as fully married to the first husband. So the marriage to the second husband never took effect, despite the fact that the first marriage had not yet been consummated. So Rav Papa said there is a difference, because in Nerish, their practice is to first marry a woman and then have intercourse with her, and afterward they seat her in the bridal chair. Right, so what they're saying is in that location, she was already fully married before she went under the wedding canopy. But otherwise, I think what they're talking about in this section is this idea that betrothal with a minor when she becomes an adult requires sexual intercourse for them to become fully married. And this had happened. She had already had intercourse with her husband before the canopy. So in this incident, the husband had already had intercourse with her once she was an adult, and that is why Rav's students did not require a bill of divorce from the second man. Presumably, but if she had not had sex with her husband and then this other man snatched her, they wouldn't have allowed him to retain her as a wife, but they would have required a bill of divorce just to make sure that any vestigial bond, legal bond, is broken. So Rav Ashi says there was a different reason. You got it wrong. Even if the practice was not as Rav Papa describes, this bride snatcher acted improperly. Consequently, they treated him improperly by annulling the legal validity of his actions, and the sages abrogated his betrothal. So Ravina said to Rav Ashi, well, this works out well if the second man betrothed her with money, when you give an exchange of something of value to symbolize that the betrothal has become real. As then the sages could declare that the money was ownerless property and void of betrothal. But if the second husband, the wife snatcher, betrothed her by means of sexual intercourse, then what is the halacha? How can the sages dissolve that betrothal when the sexual act took place? And the Gemara answers, the sages rendered his sexual act, the bride snatcher, as a licentious sexual act, which does not create a bond of betrothal. And with regard to the dispute in the MIshna, Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said the halacha is in accordance, the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, and the minor is instructed to make a declaration of refusal. Earlier, yesterday we had questioned whether in a situation where it would be better for a minor girl who is married off to some man who's inappropriate for her, we instruct her, we pressure her to refuse this man and walk away from that marriage. But there was another opinion that we shouldn't pressure girls to refuse their husbands. So here the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, and the minor is instructed to make a declaration of refusal. And likewise, Rabbi Elazar said the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. And that concludes the discussion of Mishnah number 5. Also interesting in passing, this idea that a licentious sexual act, which is extramarital sex, right? So people have sex when they're single. Some would say, well, when you have sex with a woman and you're both single and you're both Jews, so you've actually created a betrothal. It's like you married through an act of bia, through an act of sexual intercourse. However, if it's a licentious sexual act, you just meant to have sex without becoming betrothed, so it won't create a betrothal. Now, we're just mentioning that in passing. It's a much more complicated law, but, obviously we live in a time where, there's a lot of people having sex, which in the ancient world would just, be thought of as such a, like the whole world is Sodom and Gomorrah, and people having sex right and left outside of marriage. They couldn't even conceive of such a thing. And, if their opinion were to be consulted now, who knows what they would say about everything that's going on. But certainly, according to Jewish law, so the man and the woman should both be virgins when they get married. Okay, that concludes the discussion of Mishnah number 5. Now we go to Mishnah number 6, and we're well down the page on page 110a of Tractate Yevamos. Mishnah number 6. If a man was married to 2 orphaned minors and died, consummation of levirate marriage, yibum, or chalitzah, the alternative to yibum, with one of them exempts her rival wife from either yibum or chalitzah, rendering her free to remarry. Likewise, if 2 deafmutes were married to one man who died, so right, in the ancient world, they didn't have the ways of dealing with the deafmute that we have in modern times, so people can communicate and we understand that they're mentally competent. But in the ancient world, they didn't have sign language, they weren't able to teach writing maybe, and they just couldn't be sure that a deafmute could understand what was going on. So really, to protect them from being taken advantage of, they were deemed legally not competent. So here, what you've got is there are 2 cases, right? First, with a man is married to 2 minor girls, right? Their family married these girls to him. So if he dies, right? So one of them can perform yibum or chalitzah with the surviving brother, and that will exempt the other, even though their marriages are by Torah law only. Likewise, the deafmute. If somebody is married to a deafmute, that marriage exists by rabbinic law, not by Torah law. So likewise, if 2 deafmutes were married to one man and he died, so then one of the deafmute women can consummate levirate marriage, yibum, with his brother, or could perform chalitzah with his brother, and that would exempt the other deafmute wife, the co-wife. In both of these cases, both women are married by rabbinic law and consequently become Yevamos, right? Become widows in a situation, in a yibum situation where there's a Yavam, the surviving brother, but only by rabbinic law, not by Torah law. Since their statuses are equal, either both wives are deafmutes or both wives are minors, one can exempt the other through yibum or chalitzah. But if one wife is a minor and the co-wife is a deafmute, then consummation of yibum or chalitzah by one of them with the brother does not exempt the co-wife. She will also need chalitzah. They can't both marry the brother, but they will both need chalitzah. One of them could do yibum or chalitzah, and the other one will need chalitzah. And because their statuses are not the same, one cannot exempt the other. If one of the wives was halachically, legally competent, right, an adult, and not a deafmute, and the other was a deafmute, then consummation of yibum with the halakhically competent wife exempts the deafmute, as the halakhically competent wife's marriage and her levirate marriage are both by Torah law. But consummation of yibum with the deafmute does not exempt the legally competent wife. And likewise, if one was an adult woman and the other was a minor girl, consummation of yibum with the adult exempts the minor, but consummation of yibum with the minor does not exempt the adult. That's Mishnah number 6. Now, the Gemara. The Mishnah states that chalitzah by one deafmute exempts the other. Now, the Gemara asks, can a deafmute girl and a deafmute woman perform chalitzah? Well, didn't we learn in a Mishnah on page 104b that if a male deafmute performs chalitzah, and if a female deafmute performs chalitzah, and if a woman performs chalitzah on a minor boy, that in all these cases, chalitzah is disqualified. So it would seem that we already had a ruling that a deaf-mute woman who is halachically considered not competent is not able to perform chalitzah. Her chalitzah is not valid. So the difference is that, so Rav Gidel said that Rav said the Mishnah is not referring to a deaf-mute's chalitzah, but rather to consummation of yibum with one of the deaf-mute co-wives. And Rav has said you can even say it is referring to chalitzah. Here, the Mishnah is referring to a woman who was a deaf-mute from the outset when he married her. And there, the Mishnah that disqualifies the chalitzah is referring to someone who was halachically competent when she was married and afterward she became a deaf mute. Why would it matter that when she got married, she was considered legally competent, but later she became a deaf mute, and then she's not able to perform chalitzah? And the reason is, if the husband married her when she was already a deaf mute, then their marriage is by rabbinic law and not by Torah law. If when they got married she was legally competent, their marriage is by Torah law, then she becomes a deaf mute, so she's legally not competent. At that point, the chalitzah that she performs is a chalitzah by rabbinic law, but it's not sufficient to undo in the face of the halakhically valid marriage by Torah law. So the difference is that a deaf mute from the outset, just as she entered into marriage with her first husband, so she leaves the levirate bond with her yavam, right? When the husband dies, she becomes a yevama, the widow. She has a yavam, the surviving brother. They have a levirate obligation to each other. That's the levirate bond, right? So just as she entered into her marriage, so she leaves the levirate bond by means of chalitzah. So both her marriage and her status as a yevama are by rabbinic law, if she was a deaf mute when her husband married her, and she was still a deaf mute when he died. So however, one who was halakhically competent, so that she was married by Torah law, and later she became a deaf mute, no, she cannot be released by chalitzah, since recitation is indispensable for her chalitzah, and she cannot recite the text that a yevama must recite. So this is the problem with a deaf mute woman and chalitzah. She actually has to recite a text for the chalitzah to be valid. Now, I don't know what's happening in modern times. We do still do chalitzah if a man is married, dies, doesn't have a child, leaves a brother. So the brother and the widow cannot marry each other. We don't do yibum anymore, but we do chalitzah. However, if she's a deaf mute and she can't recite the text that she needs to recite as part of the chalitzah ceremony, I don't know what we do in modern times. Does she appoint an agent? Does she just do her best and then that's accepted? I'm not sure how that's done. I just don't have that information here. Abaye raised an objection to this. And is one who is a deaf mute from the outset a candidate for chalitzah? Didn't we learn in a MIshna on page 112, so we haven't reached there yet, two brothers, one who is halachically competent and one who is a deaf mute, are married to two unrelated women, one who is halachically competent and one deaf mute. So if the male who is a deaf mute and who is the husband of the female deaf mute, if he dies, what should the halachically competent man, who is the husband of the halachically competent woman, what should he do? He may consummate the levirate marriage, but there is no option of performing chalitzah. And if he wants to divorce her later, he may divorce her. Right? So here they're talking about somebody who cannot perform chalitzah because she's a deaf mute, but with a halachically competent man, they could perform yibum, get married, and then he can divorce her. She becomes a divorcee. She's disqualified from marrying a priest, but at least if they don't want to be married, they don't have to be married. If the halachically competent man, the husband of the halachically competent woman, if he dies, well then what should the male deaf mute do, who is the husband of the female deaf mute? And what should he do? He may consummate the levirate marriage, but he may never divorce her, as a deaf mute is not halachically competent to divorce a woman to whom he is married by Torah law. And what? Is this not referring to a deaf mute from the outset? And it is taught, yes, he may consummate the levirate marriage, but no, he may not perform chalitzah. Now the Gemara rejects this. No, it is referring to a halachically competent woman who later became a deaf mute, and chalitzah performed by a deaf mute does not have the power to undo a levirate bond that is valid by Torah law. Now we're on page 110b. Now, come in here a proof from a baraisa. Two halachically competent brothers are married to two unrelated women. Now we're seeing a bunch of different cases. We're definitely in that realm of the hypothetical, complex cases where we're trying to understand, well, exactly what is the law and how does the intersection of legal competence, either through being an adult or through being somebody who is, not a deaf mute, intersects with the law of yibum, and then kind of coming up with kind of strange cases that require strange resolutions just to test our understanding of the law. So come in here, a proof from a baraisa. Two halakhically competent brothers are married to two unrelated women. One who is halakhically competent and one who is a deaf mute. If the legally competent man who is the husband of the female deaf mute dies, what should the legally competent man who is the husband of the legally competent woman do? He consummates yibum with the deaf mute, and if he later wishes to divorce her, he may divorce her. But if the legally competent man who is the husband of the legally competent woman dies, what should the legally competent man who is the husband of the female deaf mute do? He may either perform chalitzah or consummate yibum. And what? Is it not the case in this baraisa that since he is legally competent from the outset, one may presume that she is a deaf mute from the outset as well? And it is taught, yes, he may consummate yibum with the Yevama who is a deaf mute, but no, he may not perform chalitzah to her because she can't recite the text of chalitzah in the ceremony, thereby indicating that chalitzah cannot be performed even though as a deaf mute from the outset, she is a Yevama by rabbinic law and not by Torah law. So the Gemara rejects this idea. Are the cases comparable? This case is as it is, i.e. the husband is competent throughout, and that case is as it is. The wife was not a deaf mute at the outset, meaning her marriage was by Torah law, but then she became a deaf mute and can't undo the marriage bond because she's unable to perform chalitzah. So the Gemara, or can't undo the levirate bond. So the Gemara raised an objection to this from a MIshna. Two brothers, one who is legally competent and one who is a deaf mute, are married to two sisters. One who is legally competent and one is a deaf mute. If the male deaf mute, who is the husband of the female deaf mute, dies, what should the legally competent man do? Who is the husband of the legally competent woman do? What should he do? The female deaf mute leaves and is exempt from yibum due to the prohibition against marrying the sister of one's wife. The fact that we have two brothers and two sisters is a further complication here. Now, if the legally competent man, who is the husband of the legally competent woman, dies, what should the male deaf mute, who is the husband of the female deaf mute, do? He releases his wife, the female deaf mute, with a bill of divorce, and his brother's wife is forbidden forever, and she may never remarry. He cannot remain married because his wife is the sister of his Yevama by Torah law. He cannot consummate yibum with her because she's the sister of his ex-wife. So apparently, chalitzah is not an option because he is a deaf mute, and his chalitzah cannot dissolve a yibum, a levirate bond that is established by Torah law. And if you would say, here too, it is referring to a man who was legally competent and later he became a deaf mute, can such a person divorce his wife? Didn't we learn the following in the MIshna on page 112? If a legally competent man married a legally competent woman and she became a deaf mute, he may divorce her. If she became mentally incompetent, he may not divorce her because a rabbinic ordinance to protect her from harm. Right? So interesting that a man who's married to a woman who, for instance, has dementia, he cannot divorce her in order to protect her because she's not legally competent. Since he was competent when he married her, he cannot dissolve a marriage that is by Torah law when he is incompetent. If he became incompetent, he cannot issue that bill of divorce. But I think also her, if she became mentally incompetent, he may not divorce her. Same thing. So rather, is it not referring to a male who was deaf mute from the outset? And since he was a deaf mute from the outset, she was also a deaf mute from the outset. And since the sisters in these cases were deaf mutes from the outset, then the unrelated women who were also deaf mutes from the outset, and we learned in the MIshna with regard to the unrelated women that yes, he may consummate the levirate marriage with them, but no, he may not perform chalitzah. And when this question was presented to Rabbah, he was silent and he had no response. When Abaye came before Rav Yosef and told him of the matter, Rav Yosef said to him, "What is the reason that you raised an objection to him based on this? For he could teach, i.e. explain to you like this. The sisters that the MIshna referred to were deaf mutes at the outset, whereas the unrelated women it referred to were legally competent women who later became deaf mutes. So rather, you should have raised an objection to him from this MIshna, the one on page 112, in the cases of two deaf mute brothers who married two legally competent sisters, or to two deaf mute sisters, or two sisters. one legally competent and one a deaf-mute. And likewise, 2 deaf-mute sisters married 2 legally competent brothers, or 2 deaf-mute brothers, or 2 brothers, one who is legally competent and one is a deaf-mute. All of these women are exempt from chalitzah and from yibum in the event of the death of one of the brothers who died without having a child. And if, in these cases, the women were unrelated to one another, then the surviving brothers should consummate yibum with them, and if they wish to divorce them, they may divorce them, but they can't perform chalitzah with a deaf-mute woman. And the Gemara clarifies what are the circumstances. If we say the MIshna is referring to men who were legally competent and they later became deaf-mutes, then in that case, can they release them? But didn't we learn in the MIshna, if she became mentally incompetent, he may not divorce her. If he became a deaf-mute or mentally incompetent, he may never divorce her. Rather, is it not referring to men who were deaf-mutes at the outset? And since they were deaf-mutes at the outset, the women were also deaf-mutes at the outset. And it taught there, if in these cases they were unrelated to one another, the surviving brothers should consummate yibum with them. This implies, yes, they should consummate yibum with them, but no, they should not perform chalitzah. And from this conclusion, it is apparent that a female deaf-mute may not perform chalitzah, and the refutation of the opinion of Rabbah is a conclusive refutation. New subject. It is taught in the MIshna, if one wife is a minor and the other is a deaf-mute, consummation of yibum or chalitzah of the Yevamos with one of them does not exempt her co-wife. So Rav Nachman said, I found Rav Ada bar Ahava and Rav Chana, his son-in-law, sitting and posing challenges to one another in the marketplace in Pumbedisa, and saying like this, that which we learned in the MIshna, that in the case of a minor and a deaf-mute, the consummation of yibum with one of them does not exempt her co-wife, applies when she happened before him for yibum as the widow of his legally competent brother. So under such circumstances, we do not know if the minor was preferable to the brother who married her initially, or if the deaf-mute was preferable to him. What is this about preference? It'll be explained. The Gemara explains, they wondered if the minor was preferable to him, since she eventually would have come to full intellectual capacity when she reached majority, right? So when she entered the marriage as a minor, it was a marriage by rabbinic law, not full-fledged by Torah law, because she was a minor at the time. However, if they remained married and she didn't refuse him, then she would become an adult and be fully legally competent. On the other hand, the deaf-mute, that marriage was by rabbinic law, and unless she somehow becomes someone, who can hear and speak, she's not going to achieve that legal competence according to the laws it was. So they wondered if the minor was preferable to him, since she eventually would have come to full intellectual capacity when she reached majority. Or if the deaf-mute was preferable, since she is an adult and she is suitable for sexual intercourse. Okay, she may not be legally competent, but she's an adult, and they may well have established that she was, of sound mind, and as an adult, they can have sex together, which you can't do with the minor. So given the uncertainty, it cannot be determined which of these marriages at the initial stage was more complete, and therefore the levirate marriage of one of them cannot exempt her rival wife. However, if she happened before him for yibum as the widow of his brother who was deaf-mute, certainly the female deaf-mute was preferable to him, as she was suitable for sexual intercourse and was of his kind, and therefore the marriage to her was more complete. And I, Rav Nachman, said to them, even if she happened before him as the widow of his brother who was deaf-mute, it is still uncertain, because the difference between the marriage of a minor and a deaf-mute in this case is independent of the original husband's preferences. They are different types of relationships. So the Gemara asks, how can their situation be rectified so that these women can remarry? And Rav Chisda said that Rav said, he consummates yibum with the deaf-mute and then releases her by means of a bill of divorce. He cannot stay married to her, because the subsequent chalitzah of the minor will disqualify her as the co-wife of his Yevama who has performed chalitzah. She's now a chalitzah. So the minor must wait until she reaches majority and then perform chalitzah. Rav Chisda said, learn from this statement that Rav holds that a married deaf-mute is partially acquired and a minor is either acquired or not acquired as a wife, i.e., there is uncertainty as to whether she was acquired completely or not acquired at all. For if it enters your mind to say the opposite, that the deaf-mute is either acquired or not acquired, while the minor is partially acquired, then with regard to the deaf-mute woman, why should he consummate yibum and then release her with a bill of divorce? Let her stay with him as she is permitted, whichever way you look at it. If she's acquired as a wife, then she's fully acquired. And if she's not acquired at all, then she is merely an unrelated woman. And if the marriage to the deceased brother was not a true marriage, there is no reason for her to be forbidden to him. Sorry I didn't give the warning. We're done. That brings us to the top of page 111a. And let me check if there are any questions or comments on this rather confusing daf that we've just covered together. Here, page 110. Okay, so Sharon, can a minor girl who is married off exercise the option of refusal after she reaches the age of majority? Fabulous question. My understanding is no, right? So she has, while she's still a minor, that she can walk away from it at any time. The question is, well, let's say that she was betrothed to this man while she was a minor, and then she becomes an adult, but they haven't consummated the union. Then I think she maybe can walk away. But if if she's like living with the man, and when she becomes an adult, they're having sex, then they're fully married, and she has no more this right of refusal. The right of refusal is meant to be used while she's still a minor. And Yosef, I think it was covered in a previous daf, and I'll look, but I'm wondering if you have discussed the question of whether a minor girl could be considered to have the mental faculties to make the refusal or acceptance. Certainly in our time, it would not seem kosher for us. Obviously, in their time, they had their reasons. Right. Well, she's definitely considered legally competent to refuse. That is the whole. It doesn't work once she's an adult. Then she can't do a refusal anymore. So that's what's interesting, right? That even though she's a minor who's not permitted to marry, we do give her the right, or the law gives her the right to walk away, right? So the threshold is much lower for her to get out of that marriage than to go into it, and that's as it should be, since this wasn't something that she had any part in creating, and it's created for her by her mother or brothers, not by her father. Now, what I am unclear on is if the father marries her off when she's a minor, does she have that right of refusal? And I'm not sure that she has it in the same way. I'm just not sure about that. It's been mentioned incidentally a few times, and they keep saying, well, if she was married off by her mother or brothers, that she has that right of refusal. So I'm thinking if she's married off by her father, she doesn't have it. And it's because the father, sort of has full control over the girl, and we expect that he will protect his daughter in a way that if he died and the family was desperate, then the mother or brothers might be a little quicker to sort of farm her out to a new husband, so they won't have to feed her, since the breadwinner has died. And again, so that right of refusal in that case is really for her protection. That's what I've got for us tonight. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Sunday, for page 111 at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Good vach, Shavua Tov.